part 2 of our lecture on violence, crime, and punishment in North America. In the first part, we encountered Canadian serial killer Clifford Olson. Olson certainly personifies well the ideas of violence and crime, but of course, violence takes on many forms, and the murders of a serial killer are relatively rare in comparison with the more widespread forms of violent crime. And not all crime is even violent. There's the whole category of property crime, focused much more on theft, for example. We could also look at white-collar crime or political corruption. One of the challenges in doing a lecture on this issue, then, is where to begin, given all the various topics that could be addressed. Crime and punishment is a complex public policy issue, but it's also an issue that does confront all three North American nations. As we'll see, relative comparisons between the three countries of North America can be difficult, given some differences in how data is collected. But as we examine the particular realities of crime and punishment in three nations, we'll try to draw some generalizations and look for some key differences and similarities. We're going to start by looking at crime and punishment in the United States. It's important to place our understanding of the current situation with respect to crime and punishment in the U.S. in some sort of historical context. If you do this from a centuries or even decades-long perspective, two quick observations can be made. First, if you look at incidents of crime relative to the overall size of the population, violent crime in the U.S. has been on the decline since colonial times. Second, though such crime has been in decline over this long period, it has still been relatively higher when compared with, say, Western Europe. In the early 20th century, for instance, there was 4 times the number of murders in Chicago than in London, England, even though London was a city with 3 times the population. In the post-World War II period, crime in the U.S. increased until it reached a peak in the period from the 1970s to the 1990s. You see that here in this graph, which focuses particularly on property crime, using data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Violent crime also followed a similar trajectory, increasing 4-fold from 1960 until the early 1990s. But as you can also see from this graph, crime in the U.S. has been in decline since the 1990s. Why the decline? That's a good question, and there are many possible answers. One possibility is an increase in the number of police that were deployed in the 90s to deal with the rising crime rates of the previous decades. Another explanation that we'll explore in greater depth in just a minute is the idea that the prison population increased from the mid-70s, and this ultimately contributed to less crime. In a previous lecture, we talked about the drug trade and the impact of crack cocaine. While crack use was on the rise in the 80s, it was in decline by the 90s. The Drugs Association, particularly with violent crime, may then help to explain why crime rates fell. In fact, there's no shortage of explanations. Scholars and analysts have pointed to a whole range of other possible factors that include the legalization of abortion, legislation aimed at increasing the resources available to law enforcement, an aging population, and even reductions in childhood exposure to lead since the 1980s. Still, in 2012, there were more than 12 million arrests in the United States. In terms of gender breakdown, about 3/4 were men and 1/4 were women. Racial categorization is a bit more difficult. FBI statistics suggest the following breakdown. Nearly 70% of arrested offenders were white, and close to 30% were black. Hispanic or Latino offenders are included within the white category here. Relating race to crime is, of course, highly controversial for lots of reasons. One only needs to think of the implications in terms of police and racial profiling to understand why this subject needs to be approached with great caution. But it's important to consider because there tends to be a disproportionate representation of minorities at the various stages of the American criminal justice system, from arrest to prosecution and finally incarceration. To put it bluntly, Black and Latino defendants are charged with and convicted of crimes that carry mandatory minimum sentences far more often than is the case proportionately for whites and Asian Americans. This brings us to the issue of punishment in prisons. The statistics related to American prisons are quite bewildering. The prison system is complex. For instance, there are federal prisons, state prisons, local jails, juvenile detention centers, and immigration detention centers. The number of incarcerated Americans is nothing short of astounding. The U.S. has the largest prison population in the world. More than 2.2 million Americans are in prison. This represents one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, at more than 700 adults in prison for every 100,000 in the overall population. And as you can see from this graph, the growth in prison populations grows dramatically beginning in the 1980s, until we begin to see some decline by the late 90s. Why is there such a relatively large prison population in the U.S.? This is an especially interesting question, given that we saw earlier how the rate of crime is actually in decline. Most analysts agree that the answer to this question lies primarily in public policy related to prison sentences. As crime rates increased in the 70s, various legislatures across the U.S. responded by increasing prison sentences for those who were convicted. It's important to remember here that there is considerable variability across the U.S. The vast majority of criminal sentences are in fact set by state and local courts. Another important trend, beginning in the 80s, was to reduce the degree of discretion a judge might exercise when considering the length of a prison sentence. Various states employ mandatory minimum and guideline-based sentencing that remove the more human element in assigning punishments. A very good example of this is what has come to be known as three strikes laws. While Washington State and California were the first to implement such legislation, more than 20 other states have now implemented some version of a three strikes law. Principally, such laws serve to increase the prison sentences of anyone convicted of a felony who has previously been convicted of 2 or more violent crimes or serious felonies. In effect, judges are virtually instructed or forced to give such offenders life sentences. Violent offenses under such three-strike statutes typically include murder, armed robbery of a residence, assault with intent to rob or murder, rape, and other sex offenses. The category of serious felonies widens out the list of potential offenses to include crimes such as burglary of a residence. While the emphasis in such laws tends towards punishing violent felonies, in fact, even non-violent felonies can sometimes trigger their application. In California, for example, it was possible for a misdemeanor crime to become a third strike. In one instance, a man was given 2 25 to life sentences for various shoplifting charges that were considered felonies under the state's three strikes law. Another grave concern here is that such laws tend to disproportionately impact minorities. Again, to use California as an example, African Americans are estimated to be about 3 to 6% of the state's population. Yet African Americans are said to represent about 33% of second strikers and 44% of third strikers among California prison inmates. Similarly, studies of sentencing in Florida have also found that women who were African American were far more likely to be sentenced under three strike statutes. It's not surprising that these racial disparities in sentencing are then reflected by disproportionate prison populations of visible minorities. To give just one snapshot, we can use U.S. Bureau of Justice statistics to review the incarceration rate of Hispanic, Black, and white men in the U.S. in 2010. The numbers do vary slightly from one year to the next, but the relative proportions remain remarkably consistent year after year. Here, Black, non-Hispanic men were incarcerated at the rate of 4,347 inmates for every 100,000 American residents of the same race and gender. For Hispanic males, the incarceration rate was 1,755 inmates. Finally, for white males, the incarceration rate was 678 inmates per 100,000 American residents, again of the same gender and race. To finish up this part of the lecture, it's worth briefly reviewing the state of affairs when it comes to crime and punishment in America. What we've seen is that crime rates and arrests rose dramatically from the 80s to the 90s, but have entered into a period of decline more recently. There's not a lot of agreement, though, on just why that decline has started. It's clear, however, that the U.S. imprisons, relatively speaking, a much larger proportion of its population when compared to other countries. While Canada and Mexico respectively have prison population rates of 118 and 210 per 100,000 of total national population, the U.S. has a prison population rate of 716. And the demographic composition of the American prison population demonstrates that visible minorities are consistently imprisoned at a rate that far outpaces their relative percentages of the population as a whole. Various legislative initiatives to set and lengthen mandatory prison sentences are clearly impacting the remarkable rates of incarceration in America. But this has already led to increasing discussion about the sustainability of such a system. That's it for this part of the lecture. In the next part, we'll turn our attention to the Canadian criminal justice system. Bye for now.
Breathe.